We all know that foundational story.
Mhm.
Genesis, the garden, Adam, and then, well, Eve. Traditionally, she's the first woman, right? The mother of all living.
Absolutely. It's a narrative that's truly shaped so much, inspired awe, endless debate too, and countless interpretations over millennia.
Yeah, but here's where it gets really interesting for me. What if that picture isn't the whole story? What if the biblical text itself kind of hints at someone before Eve?
That's exactly the question we're diving into today. And just to be clear, our mission isn't about challenging Scripture, not at all.
No, definitely not.
It's more about exploring its, let's say, hidden depths. We want to look at the ancient languages, the traditions, see if there are secrets there about Eve, the garden,
Yeah.
and maybe even a woman who came before her.
Okay, so the traditional understanding for centuries really has been pretty straightforward. Eve, first woman, God crafts her specifically as a companion for Adam.
And we see that so clearly in Genesis chapter 2, verses 21, 22. The deep sleep, the rib or side, as we might get into.
Right. Fashioning Eve from Adam himself. It's
Yeah.
this really powerful image, isn't it? She's not from the dust like Adam was.
No, she's from Adam, signifying that deep connection, that unity, partnership.
And then you have Genesis 3.20, where Adam names her Eve. Why? Because she would be the mother of all the living.
Exactly. And that Hebrew name, Chava, it comes from the root word for life. It really reinforces her role as the origin, the source of the human lineage. It's deeply symbolic.
It really is. So the traditional order feels very set. Adam from dust, then the animals, then Eve from Adam's side, a picture of connection.
Yeah.
But then you flip back to Genesis chapter 1, and it reads differently. Verse 27. So God created mankind in his own image. In the image of God, he created them. Male and female, he created them.
Right there, male and female,
Yeah.
together at the same time.
No dust, no rib, no waiting for Adam. Just created in God's image.
So you immediately see this tension, or at least a difference in focus between the two accounts.
A huge difference. One simultaneous, the other sequential. So it begs the question, and this is a key question for you listening. Is Genesis 2 the whole story about the first woman? Or is Genesis 1 adding another layer?
And that tension, that apparent,
Yeah.
let's call it a variation. And it hasn't gone unnoticed historically, not by a long shot. Readers have grappled with this for centuries.
You mean it's not just us noticing this now?
Oh no. Genesis 1 gives us this grand cosmic picture. Very orderly, structured, almost poetic, right?
Yeah.
Male and female created together on day 6.
Yeah.
Universal.
Okay.
Then Genesis 2 zooms in. It's personal, narrative, focused on relationships. God, man, woman. Man formed first before plants and animals in this account, put in Eden, then the animals as potential helpers, and then woman from his side.
It's like different camera angles on the same event, highlighting different things.
Precisely. And ancient Jewish interpreters, they absolutely picked up on this. In texts like the Talmud and Midrash, these huge collections of rabbinic discussions on the Bible.
Developed over centuries, right?
Exactly. They wrestled with this. Some early rabbis actually suggested these could be two separate acts of creation.
Wow. Okay, so not just different descriptions, but different events.
That was a line of thought, which led some to wonder, could there have been a first woman in Genesis 1 and then Eve, a separate creation, in Genesis 2?
Which leads us directly to Lilith.
It certainly opens the door to that discussion. Lilith is this figure who isn't in Genesis itself, but looms large in post-biblical Jewish tradition.
Post-biblical, meaning written down much later.
Much later. Texts like the Alphabet of Ben Sira, maybe 8th to 10th century AD. So centuries after the Bible was finalized. But in these texts, Lilith is described as Adam's first wife.
Okay, first wife. How was she created according to this legend?
At the same time as Adam, and crucially, from the same dust, not from his side.
Okay, so created equally, from the same source material, you might say.
Exactly. She wasn't secondary. She stood beside him, an equal from the start, which, as you said, isn't the story most of us know.
Not at all. So what went wrong, according to the legend?
Well, the story goes that Lilith refused to submit to Adam. She basically said, hang on, we're equal. We were both made from the earth.
That sounds pretty revolutionary for the time.
Extremely.
Yeah.
And because she wouldn't accept a subordinate role, the legend says she uttered God's ineffable name and fled Eden.
She just left.
She left.
Yeah.
And in response, this tradition says, God then created Eve from Adam's rib, symbolizing perhaps that unity, but also maybe a different kind of relationship structure, maybe emphasizing submission in a way Lilith wouldn't accept.
So in that interpretation, Lilith is the Genesis 1 woman, Eve is the Genesis 2 woman. It's a neat way to try and square the circle of those two accounts.
It is. It's one way some traditions try to reconcile them.
But it raises a huge question for you, the listener. If the story was circulating, why isn't Lilith in Genesis?
That is the million-dollar question. Interestingly, the name Lilith does appear once in the Hebrew Bible. Isaiah 34.14.
Okay, what does it say?
It's describing this desolate wasteland in the future. And it says something like, wild animals will meet hyenas. The goat demon will call to its kind. There, too, Lilith shall repose and find a resting place.
Lilith, specifically.
The Hebrew word is Lilith. Now, some translations render it night creature or screech owl. It's debated. But many scholars think, yeah, this could actually be a reference to that same mythological figure, maybe an echo of an older belief that just barely makes it into the main text.
Like a little footnote hinting at a bigger story happening off stage?
Potentially. And over time, Lilith's image, well, it changed dramatically.
How so? From this equal partner figure?
Yeah, in later folklore and occult traditions, she often becomes more of a demoness figure, symbolizing rebellion, untamed femininity, sometimes even a seductress who harms children.
Wow, quite a transformation.
It is. But it's important to remember that earlier portrayal in texts like Ben Sira, it was about a woman wanting equality. So Lilith offers one possible explanation. But let's dig even deeper now. Let's look at the original Hebrew.
Yes, because language matters so much here. What clues are hidden in the actual words?
Absolutely. Going back to the Hebrew can unlock meanings lost in translation. Let's start with Genesis 1.27 again. So God created man in his own image. Male and female, he created them.
Okay, the word for man there.
It's Adam. Now, we usually think Adam, the first guy's name. But in Hebrew, Adam can also mean, more broadly, humanity, humankind. It can be gender neutral.
Okay. So in this context, Genesis 1, it might not mean a specific male individual.
Many scholars argue exactly that here Adam refers to the human species, encompassing both sexes.
So when it says God created them male and female.
The Hebrew words are zakar and nekheva. These are specific biological terms for male and female anatomy. But they appear together, created simultaneously, within that initial Adam or humanity. It implies equality from the start.
So the original language itself supports an interpretation beyond just the traditional one.
Definitely. Shows there's nuance there. Now, contrast that with Genesis 2.7. Then the Lord God formed a man from the dust of the ground.
Same word, Adam.
Same word, Adam. But here the context feels much more specifically male. He's formed before the woman.
And it mentions the ground he's formed from.
Right, Adama in Hebrew. Which is interesting because Adama, ground, is the feminine form of the root word for Adam, man, humanity.
Whoa, okay, so there's a linguistic link between the man and the earth, built right into the words, like highlighting his physical origin, his connection to the ground.
Exactly. It suggests that physicality, maybe even mortality, it's a subtle but powerful connection in the Hebrew.
Okay, so what about the rib? Genesis 2.2122, Eve from the rib. That feels very specific.
It does. The Hebrew word translated as rib is sela.
Sela, okay. Does it only mean rib?
Well, that's the key. Rib is one valid translation. But sela can also mean side, like the side of a building, the side of the Ark of the Covenant, the side of a mountain, a whole side.
Wait, not just one small bone, but potentially a whole side of Adam.
That's a very possible interpretation of the Hebrew, that God took a whole side, or perhaps even metaphorically, half of Adam.
That completely changes the feeling of it. It's not taking a minor part, it's dividing a whole.
Precisely. It suggests maybe a division of one unified being into two equals, rather than creating the woman from a lesser part of the man.
Which then makes Adam's reaction in the next verse make even more sense. Genesis 2.23. This is now bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh.
Exactly. It's this profound recognition of shared essence, of being fundamentally the same. Not you came from a small part of me, but you are me, we are one flesh.
So if Genesis 2 is about this division of one into two equals.
And maybe Genesis 1, with its simultaneous creation of male and female as Adam, humanity, is describing the original whole undivided human. Some mystical interpretations even suggest an androgynous being initially.
Which brings us right back to, who is the female part of that initial creation in Genesis 1? Is it Lilith? Is it just an unnamed aspect of primordial humanity? The Hebrew opens up these possibilities.
It absolutely does. And these nuances, these differences between Genesis 1 and 2, they weren't lost on early theologians either. This wasn't just a modern debate.
Right. You mentioned Jewish interpreters, but what about early Christian thinkers? How did they handle these two accounts?
Oh, they definitely engaged with it. The early church fathers, various theologians, even groups considered outside the mainstream like the Gnostics, they all wrestled with Genesis 1 versus Genesis 2.
Like Augustine, he was a major figure.
Augustine of Hippo, yes. He had this idea of a dual-layer interpretation. He suggested Genesis 1 described humanity's spiritual nature, our creation in God's image, kind of conceptually.
Okay, the ideal, maybe.
And then Genesis 2 described our physical, historical formation, our entry into the world as we know it. He didn't necessarily see them as contradictory, but as complementary. Genesis 1 maybe more figurative, Genesis 2 more literal in some ways.
That's one way to harmonize them. Were there other views?
Oh, yes. Origen, another influential early thinker, had ideas about the original human being spiritual, later clothed in flesh, which has some echoes of Gnostic thought, actually.
Yeah.
Then you had others, like Irenaeus, who strongly argued that Eve was the first woman, specifically created for God's plan of redemption. No wiggle room there.
So even within orthodoxy, there wasn't one single, uniform view from the start?
Not entirely. There was speculation even then that Genesis 1's male and female might refer to humanity more broadly, beyond just the individuals Adam and Eve. And then, of course, you had the Gnostics.
Right, you mentioned them. They often had pretty different takes on things, didn't they?
Very different. Gnosticism emphasized secret knowledge, esoteric understanding. Some Gnostic texts, like the Apocryphon of John, even talked about multiple Eves.
Multiple Eves?
Yeah, like a spiritual Eve existing in a higher realm, and then the physical Eve we know, who they saw as sort of an imperfect copy created in the material world.
Wow, that's a radical departure.
Absolutely. And these views were ultimately condemned as heresy by the developing church. But the point is, the sheer existence of these debates, these diverse interpretations from the earliest centuries.
It shows that questioning the simple Eve was first, end of story narrative isn't some modern, radical idea. People have been pondering these complexities in the text for a very, very long time.
Exactly. It puts our own questions into a much larger historical context.
Okay, so let's shift slightly and look at another key piece, Eve's naming. Genesis 3:20. Adam named his wife Eve because she would become the mother of all the living. That sounds pretty definitive, doesn't it? Mother of all the living.
It does sound definitive on the surface. But again, let's look at the Hebrew. The word for living is che.
Che. Okay, what's the scope of that word?
Well, it's broad. It means life, being alive, things that live, those who live. It doesn't explicitly say mother of every single human being ever created from the dawn of time.
Ah, so it doesn't have to mean literally every single person.
Not necessarily. It could mean mother of all the living within a specific context. Perhaps all those living within the covenant line that starts with them, or all those who descend from her union with Adam, the central figures of this particular narrative.
So it's a question of scope again. Is it universally all humans or all humans relevant to this story, this plan God is unfolding?
Precisely. It raises a really interesting theological point for you to consider. Was Eve biologically the first female human ever? Or was she the first woman within God's specific redemptive plan, the matriarch of the line leading toward salvation history?
And that distinction is crucial. It could allow for others outside that specific line.
It potentially could. Which brings us, naturally, to that age-old question. Cain's wife.
Yes. Always the puzzle. Cain kills Abel, gets banished, goes off to the land of Nod, and finds a wife. Where on earth did she come from?
Exactly. The Bible just states it as fact. He went to Nod, he knew his wife, she conceived. It doesn't say she was a sister he happened to meet there.
And Genesis mentions Adam and Eve having other sons and daughters later, but the timing with Cain finding a wife seems, well, it suggests other people were already around.
It strongly suggests it. And this is where some people bring in theories like a pre-Adamic race.
Meaning people created before Adam, maybe linked to that Genesis 1 creation.
That's one idea. That Genesis 1 describes an initial creation of humanity, and Genesis 2 focuses on Adam and Eve for a specific purpose. There's also the gap theory, some propose.
Exactly.
It's the idea that there might be a vast unrecorded time gap between Genesis 1.1, in the beginning God created, and Genesis 1.2, now the earth was formless and empty. Maybe a previous world existed and fell into ruin in that gap.
Speculative, but it tries to account for things.
It does. And think about Genesis 1.28 again. God tells the male and female he just created Be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth.
So the earth, not just fill the garden.
Right. It implies an existing habitable earth ready for population. Contrast that with Genesis 2, where Adam is placed specifically in the Garden of Eden. It suggests a wider world outside that garden.
A world Cain could wander into and find people. Like his wife.
Plausibly, yes. Descendants of that initial Genesis 1 creation, perhaps. Even the Jewish historian Josephus, writing in the 1st century, acknowledged Adam and Eve had many children. But the text itself is sparse on details about who else was around and when.
So you could almost see it maybe as Genesis 1 being about humanity broadly and Genesis 2 zooming in on Adam and Eve for the start of the covenant story.
That's a coherent way to look at it.
Yeah.
And then you have other intriguing, slightly mysterious passages later on, like in Genesis 6.
Ah, the sons of God and the daughters of humans.
Exactly. Who are these distinct groups? Some interpret that as another hint of potentially different human lines or origins interacting.
Yeah.
It's complex, debated stuff, but it adds to the picture that the early world might have been more populated than just Adam's direct line initially.
Okay, so if there were these other people, descendants of a Genesis 1 creation, perhaps living outside Eden, why isn't the Bible more focused on them? Why the intense focus just on Adam and Eve's line?
And that, I think, brings us to the theological core of it for you, the listener. It might be about the purpose of the biblical narrative itself, meaning perhaps the Bible's primary focus isn't to give an exhaustive account of every human group ever created, but to trace a specific story. The story of God's covenant relationship with humanity, the line leading to Israel and ultimately to Jesus Christ.
So Eve's real significance might not be about being woman number one chronologically.
Perhaps not solely. Perhaps her paramount significance lies in her role as the first woman in God's covenantal plan, the chosen matriarch of the specific lineage through which redemption would come.
Ah, so in that sense, she is the mother of all the living.
Exactly. Mother of all those living within that covenant story, all those who are kind of the narrative of redemption that unfolds from Genesis onwards. There could well have been others outside that specific story, but they aren't the focus here.
That makes sense. It brings that phrase, fill the earth, from Genesis 1 back into perspective, too. If the earth was already there, maybe already populated to some degree.
Then Adam and Eve's placement in the garden in Genesis 2 represents the start of something new within that existing world, a specific intimate covenant relationship with God.
And all the living from Genesis 3.20 might refer more to the vitality, the continuation, the legacy of that specific covenant line, rather than every single biological human.
I think that's a very strong possibility. And it fits a pattern you see throughout the Bible, doesn't it?
So.
God consistently chooses specific people for specific purposes. He chooses Abraham out of all the people in Ur. He chooses Jacob over Esau. He chooses the nation of Israel. He chooses Mary. The focus narrows onto the line he is working through for his redemptive plan.
Right. It's not always about cataloging everyone else, but following that main thread.
Precisely.
Yeah.
So maybe Eve isn't the first woman biologically, full stop. But she is absolutely the first foundational woman in God's redemptive story as told in the Bible. And maybe that's why the narrative doesn't spend time detailing Cain's wife or any other groups potentially outside Eden. They weren't part of that central covenantal plotline.
Oh, okay. So wrapping this deep dive up, it seems the question, was Eve the first woman, is way more complex than a simple yes or no.
Much more. The Bible itself gives us these intriguing layers. Genesis 1 suggesting simultaneous creation of male and female.
Then Genesis 2 detailing Eve's formation from Adam, starting that crucial covenant line.
And then hints, like Cain's wife, suggesting others might have existed outside the garden.
So the big takeaway idea, maybe, is that Eve's primary significance isn't necessarily about when she was created relative to all possible humans.
But about why. Her crucial role in God's plan of salvation. She's the first mother in that specific, vital lineage.
It really highlights the Bible as this layered revelation, doesn't it? Sometimes mysterious. Like that verse in Proverbs says, "It is the glory of God to conceal a matter."
But the glory of kings is to search it out. Exactly. Yeah. We're invited to explore these depths.
So the really compelling question for you to ponder might not just be, was Eve the first woman ever created?
But maybe, was Eve the first woman chosen for the divine family line, the lineage leading to redemption?
A really key distinction. We hope this exploration has given you a lot to think about. What stood out most to you? What new questions does it raise?
We genuinely would love to hear your reflections. Please drop your comments below. And, if you found this dive into Genesis fascinating,
let us know what other biblical mysteries you'd like us to tackle. Maybe dig deeper into Lilith? or the Nephilim from Genesis 6, or this whole idea of a pre-Adamic race?
Yeah, let us know. And please subscribe so you don't miss our future explorations. Like this, share it with others who you think might find this discussion interesting.
Absolutely. Until our next deep dive, keep asking questions, keep exploring the text, stay curious and stay faithful, keep seeking those truths that might be hidden in plain sight. May you be blessed.